To start this session, we'd like to start our session today by honoring the land that we're on, which has been the site of human activity since time immemorial. It is the traditional territories of the Wendat, Anishinabek, the Wichipiwe, Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Ontario is covered by 46 treaties and other agreements, and is home to many Indigenous nations from across Turtle Island, including the Inuit and the Métis. These treaties and other agreements, including the One Dish with One Spoon Baboon Belt Covenant, are agreements to peacefully share and care for the land and its resources. Other Indigenous nations, Europeans, and newcomers were invited to this covenant in the spirit of respect, peace, and friendship. We are all treaty people. Many of us have come here as settlers, immigrants, newcomers in this generation or generations past. We are mindful of broken covenants, and we strive to make this right with the land and with each other. I will also like to acknowledge those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. And so I honor and pay tribute to the ancestors of African origin and descent.
Thanks, Angelica. I also want to invite all of us to not only acknowledge and act to honor Indigenous connection to this land, but also to work to address the ways in which settler colonialism continues to impact Indigenous communities on a daily basis. For those of us who work to support newcomers to this land, I think that includes challenging the ways in which the newcomer serving sector, often called the settlement sector, is intertwined with ongoing settler colonialism. The structures of settler colonialism are linked to inclusion and exclusion in Canada, and this includes the ways in which the precarious and non-status of many newcomers impacts how they find themselves navigating employment and the labor market. Earlier this year, members of TSLIP's Newcomer Services Collaboration Working Group and Employment Working Group had identified newcomer labor trafficking and exploitation as increasingly urgent issues for our work plans. We also heard from our partners working in the sector that identifying and understanding labor trafficking and exploitation of newcomers and what supports exist was of high priority and of interest to them through a needs assessment that we conducted. This webinar is also timely as it aligns with the grassroots-led campaign for regularization that's underway to push the federal government to act broadly and meaningfully on increasing pathways to permanent residency, something that I think we'll hear a little bit about from our presenters today as well. And we'll be having a Q&A session following the presentations, at which time you can add your questions to the chat or use the hand raise function to ask your question directly. And so with that, thank you to our presenters for being here. I'll pass it over to Leah, Varka, and Jovana to introduce themselves and to get started.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that, that overview, Jesse. My name is Leah Watkiss. I work for the Sisters of St. Joseph of Toronto in their Ministry for Social Justice, Peace and Creation Care. Our office are the administrators and coordinators of the CNEE, which is the Collaborative Network to End Exploitation. My colleague Varka and I will be speaking to you this afternoon about the temporary foreign worker program, the problems with the way the program is designed, and why a lot of workers end up in precarious situations. Varka, do you want to say?
Just to say hello, everyone. I am the program manager in the Ministry for Social Justice, Peace and Creation Care. And I guess let's start there.
Okay.
I can introduce myself. I'm Jovana. I'm the Anti-Human Trafficking Coordinator at FCJ Refugee Centre. We are located in Toronto, and we support those who are either at risk or have lived experience of exploitation, whether that's for labor or for sexual exploitation as well. And I'll be talking a little bit about the kinds of supports that are available, the work that we're doing, and how you can support any newcomers that are at risk or in conditions of exploitation.
Cool. So Varka and I will get started now with our presentation here. Here we go. Off to the races. So CNEE, so thank you for doing the land acknowledgement. We also like to open with a land acknowledgement and a labor acknowledgement. So we acknowledge the labor and sacrifices of poor and racialized workers on the lands known as Canada. This nation's settler colonial history includes, among others, the exploited labor of over 200 years of enslaved African and Indigenous peoples, Chinese workers forced to pay a head tax to come and perform work considered too dangerous for Canadian workers, agricultural and other migrant workers indentured to their employers with closed work permits. These and other violent practices have allowed Canada to accumulate wealth and power. Canada continues to profit from the historic and ongoing exploitation of poor and racialized people. CNEE, Collaborative Network to End Exploitation, is committed to redressing this legacy. So the Collaborative Network to End Exploitation, or CNEE, is a collaboration of faith-based organizations, community groups, individuals working to raise awareness about the spectrum of exploitation of human beings and to inspire action for structural and societal changes. We collaborate with numerous networks and organizations. We are a member of the Toronto Counter-Human Trafficking Network. We're part of the Anti-Human Trafficking Subcommittee of the Canadian Council for Refugees. We've also met with numerous politicians and civil servants to discuss strategies and raise awareness about the exploitation of migrant workers. These include the previous Premier of Ontario, the current Ontario Minister of Labour, as well as representatives of the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services. So CNEE, we are not frontline service providers. We focus on the systemic and structural inequalities that lead to the exploitation. And we try to raise public awareness and push for changes. The changes that we push for are rooted in the feedback and information that we get from our frontline partners and from migrant workers. So like the Migrant Rights Network and Migrant Workers Alliance for Change. So moving on to our topic for today. A big part of what we do, as I say, is public education and awareness raising. And to that end, we recently had an animated video created that introduces some of the many problems with the temporary foreign worker program. So I'm going to share that video with you.
Most people choose fruits and vegetables to buy based on the conditions of the produce itself. Is it fresh? Organic, local? But what about the conditions of the workers who grew them? You might assume that when you buy Canadian-grown produce, the workers are safe, fairly paid, happy, but you would be wrong. Canadian agriculture, like many sectors of our economy, relies heavily on the labor of the temporary foreign worker program. Economic inequalities force millions of migrants, mainly from the global south, to seek livelihoods elsewhere. Recruiters promise good wages, fair working conditions, and even permanent residency. So workers take out loans, pack their bags, and come to Canada filled with hope. But when they arrive, many discover they've been tricked. Working conditions are unsafe. Living conditions are crowded, dirty, and in disrepair. They face mistreatment. They work from dawn to dusk and are paid a fraction of their promised wage. Closed work permits exclude migrant workers from the basic right to change employers, making them easy targets for exploitation. Workers who raise complaints are regularly fired and deported, driving them and their families into poverty. Employers hold extraordinary power. But there is hope. Migrant workers are organizing resistance for their basic human rights. Stand in solidarity with them. Ask questions about the food you buy and the services you use. Support local migrant worker groups. Tell politicians to grant migrant workers permanent resident status. Participate in our migrant workers' experiential exercise. Together we can uphold the rights and dignity of migrant workers.
So this video is available on our website, which you see there, cnee.ca. It's on YouTube, it's on our social media. Please, we encourage you to use this video, to share it, and we hope that it will help you in spreading awareness and helping create systemic change.
Thank you, Leah, for introducing the CNE and play the video. I hope people use in your work, in their work, the video for awareness and for advocacy as well. Today we're going to focus mostly on the temporary foreign worker program, but I want to acknowledge before I start that we, for us, migrant workers also include everybody who is here as a migrant and is working on a work permit, including international students, including refugee claimants. Also, there are quite a lot non-status workers here as well, who are doing the work, but also are subjected to exploitation. But as I said, today we're going to focus on the temporary foreign worker program and the migrant workers who are coming through this program. So exploitation and trafficking of migrant workers in Canada is a social justice issue that is central to our work as a collaborative network. The treatment of migrant workers here, those working on farms, restaurants, hotels, construction sites, just to name a few industries, is unjust and unheeded. For years, migrant workers courageously organized to raise their voice to tell the government and Canadians about the exploitation they suffer, the deplorable living and working conditions they are subjected to, but to no avail. In the moments when Canadians show some outrage because they learn about the treatment of workers, the government just makes some minor changes to the policies by introducing some band-aid solutions and pretend that systemic injustices have been addressed. In that way, our collective consciousness is soothed and we continue with our lives, when in fact, nothing has changed. And the same rampant exploitation continues to ravage migrant workers' communities. And I think, and we all know, COVID exposed those systemic failures. And unfortunately, but not unexpectedly, many migrant workers died as a result of this political neglect. A few weeks ago, and I'm not sure if you followed the news, but a few weeks ago, a group of Jamaican migrant workers, again, courageously wrote and sent an open letter to their Ministry of Labor describing the situation in Canada as a systemic slavery. And I want to read some excerpts from this letter because they speak loudly of the treatment of workers. And I will try to read this slowly so we can sink in the moment. So they said, we are living in a first world country, but at both these farms, rats are eating our food. We do not have clothes, dryers, so when it rains, we are forced to wear cold, wet clothing to work. We live in crowded rooms and have zero privacy. There are cameras around the houses, so it feels like we are in prison. We work for 8 months on minimum wage and can survive for 4 months back home. Employers treat us like we are not human beings. They don't care about us. We are not asking for charity. We are proud people and we are looking for dignity, respect, and fairness. Next slide. We are treated like mules and punished for not working fast enough. We are exposed to dangerous pesticides without proper protection. Our bosses are verbally abusive, swearing at us. They physically intimidate us, destroy our property, and threaten to send us home. When we call our liaison officers for help, they do not respond to us, or worse, they take our boss's side and put a red mark next to our name, so we are not hired back anywhere next season. This fear is what stops us and our fellow migrant workers from speaking up for our rights as workers and humans. Well, their word sums up all disposable human beings treated without any dignity and respect for their humanity. And I want to leave a few seconds here so we can sit in and reflect on that act of hopelessness, but also at the same time with that act of courageousness, because the workers knew what they are risking by being vocal and speaking for themselves. And despite all, they spoke up. But who will listen? So just a few seconds here to kind of sink in with that thought. Okay, and then next slide. So before I outline some of the inconsistencies in the temporary foreign worker program that are making those workers exploitable, I want to quickly run through the main policy aspect of the temporary foreign worker program and how it functions in general. So we know that this program allows employers in Canada to temporarily hire foreign workers when they cannot find any Canadians for the job. So there are two streams of this program. One is the high wage stream and the low wage stream. Today we will be discussing the low wage stream, since the vulnerability of the workers within this stream is far greater than the other one. So within this low wage stream, there are 4 categories. Is the caregiver program is the formerly known as the live-in caregiver program. The second stream is the stream for low wage occupations, where people through this stream are hired to work in restaurants, in fast food places, hotels, and so on. The third stream is the agricultural stream. It's similar to the stream for low wage occupations, but people who are coming through this stream are employed only within the agricultural sector. So in both those streams, the second and the third one, people come with work permits and they are allowed to stay for 2 years, and then they can extend their work permits after those 2 years. And the fourth stream within this program is the seasonal agricultural worker program, which is quite different than the other 2 programs. Workers under that program are entitled to work in Canada for a maximum of 8 months in any calendar year, and there is no limit of how many times workers from the swap program can come to work in Canada. They can come for 1 year, for 5 years, for 5 years, 10 years. Some workers also come for more than 15, 20, 25 years. However, regardless of how many times workers come through this program, they cannot access permanent residency. In fact, nobody within the low wage stream of the temporary foreign worker program can access permanent residency, except for care workers. However, there are many restrictions and inconsistencies within that as well. Just before moving to the next slide, just to point out that currently there are a few pilot programs that are allowing migrant workers within the meat and meat packaging and mushroom industry to apply for PR. However, those programs are only pilots, and they're only for those workers who are within that industry, specific industry. Next slide. So Before Canadian employers can hire a foreign worker, they must obtain a permission in the form of labor market impact assessment from the Employment and Social Development Canada. Once the employer received a positive or neutral LMA, then the migrant worker has to apply within the Immigration Refugee Citizenship Canada for their work permit. Although their work permit, they might be granted a work permit, their work permit is not given right away. They have to come to Canada, and at the border, Canadian Border Service Agency screens the workers for compliance with the general criteria for admissibility. And if they meet all those requirements, then the CBSA officer grants the entry of the worker. They give them the physical piece of paper, their work permit. Then employers within this program, they're looking to hire foreign workers through the low wage stream. They also have to pay for round-trip transportation for the worker. They have to ensure that there is some affordable housing available, pay for the private health insurance until the worker has access to the provincial insurance, and register the temporary foreign worker within the provincial and territorial workplace safety board. Though those expenses should be covered by the employer, it is very, very common for employers to take back what they have paid when they hire the workers through some random deductions within the workers' paychecks. And later on in the presentation, we're going to show you a picture of such paycheck, so you have an idea what I'm saying. So what is important to understand is that temporary foreign worker program itself is the main driver for migrant worker exploitation in Canada. Migrant workers come on temporary basis to fill labor demand that is not temporary, but permanent. But luring migrant workers into a system that has afforded them very few rights, limited access to services, is exploitive in itself. In 2016, there was a study done in Edmonton, Alberta, and this study identified that the temporary foreign worker program, specifically the low wage stream, prevails as the primarily vehicle by which labor trafficking occurs in Edmonton. And I will add, from some years working in this field, that this conclusion can be extended to any city and any province in Canada. By manipulating a weak system that fails to protect workers' rights, recruiters and employers exploit and traffic workers across Canada, and they are hardly facing any punishment. Business reap immense profits on the back of the migrant workers, hard labor, and at the same time, workers are living and working in deplorable conditions. The monitoring mechanism to ensure that the workers' rights are protected is virtually non-existent. Last year, or I think it was the year before, the Auditor General slammed the federal government for failing to protect migrant workers. The AG report concluded that the federal government system of inspection and enforcement is deeply flawed. However, the government has again introduced some very minor changes, which hasn't resulted in any improvement of the condition of migrant workers. What makes the temporary foreign worker program even weaker in terms of enforcement is the fact that it is legislated through the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act and regulations. However, this program is jointly administered by the Employment and Social Development Canada, by the IRCC and CBSA. What does that mean is that the entry of migrant workers and their right to stay in Canada is regulated through the federal immigration policy and legislation, while their employment rights are regulated through the provincial law and policies, as well as the inspections through farms and other placement of places of work are carried by the ESDC. So in many situations of exploitation, it is not clear which government is responsible and accountable for what, but also it's like the vicious circle, everybody blame everybody else. So one fact is clear, though, that there is a huge power imbalance in the relationship between employer and worker. And beside the flaws within the program and policies itself, we had to deal the poverty and economic conditions in the countries of origin of the workers that are tipping the imbalance and the scale towards the benefit of the employer. Because, and we know this, that the financial dependency of families and communities back home makes rightly many workers afraid to respond to the abuse and mistreatment because they are jeopardizing their stay in Canada. And so there are a few stages of the process that workers are going through, and through all those stages, they are exploited severely. And I'm using here this graph, and I took this graph. There's a research made by Faye Faraday, it's called Made in Canada, and it's a very thorough research. Although it was done quite a few years ago, many of the findings of this research that were made back then are still relevant today. So starting with the recruitment, you may know that migrant workers have to pay recruiters back home to secure employment in Canada. Recruitment in the country of origin is exploitive and largely is uncontrolled. Many workers pay between $1,000 or as much as $20,000 or $40,000 for the possibility to come to Canada. Very often, employers also act as recruiters in the country of origin. In quite a few cases, employers directly go to the country of origin to solicit workers by promising them work permits upon entry and also fair wages. Workers are pressured to enter Canada as visitors with the promise of obtaining work permit after they arrive, and the promise of work permit or even PR, which they will never have access to, is consistently used as a tool to keep workers in exploitative situations. It is not uncommon for workers to have paid exuberant fees, arrive in Ontario, to find out that they are lied to, they are lied to the job they're going to perform, or there is not such a job, or the job that they're going to perform is different than the work authorization, which puts them in a very precarious situation because they are technically violating the conditions of their work authorization. And while there's a current legislation in Ontario called Employment Protection for Foreign Nationals Act, and it prohibits employers and recruiters to charge workers directly or indirectly recruitment fees, this legislation is very limited, and there are many reasons for this, but one of those reasons is the fact that most part of the recruitment is happening in countries of origin. Oh, I was told that I have 5 minutes, then I will speed up. So the other part of the recruitment of the process of coming to Canada is the work permit. So work permit is issued to workers that are coming from the work permit that is issued to workers coming from this stream is called employer specific or tied work permit. So the workers can work only for the specific employer named on the permit. They have to do the job that is named on the permit, and they have to work from the location that is authorized on the permit for the time period that is on the permit. Otherwise, they will be violating their permit. And with those closed work permits, migrants' rights to labor mobility is severely limited and restrains their ability to negotiate working conditions, pay, and everything else. Workers in Canada that are Canadian citizens and PRs can quit their jobs and their employment anytime. And while this is not easy and can jeopardize their income security, still comparing to migrant workers in cases of mistreatment and abuse, those workers, Canadians and PRs, can at least they can leave the work. Many politicians, they are using some arguments to avoid dealing with the tied work permit system, because they are also under severe pressure from from employer lobbies to leave the system in place. So they use few arguments that are not sustained, because they're saying, yes, the temporary foreign workers with closed work permits technically can change employers. Yes, they can change employers, but the process takes so much time. And during this time, while they're waiting for this process, they cannot work legally in Canada. Also, some say, oh yes, but in terms of abuse, when there's abuse happening, they have this new tool called Open Work Permit for vulnerable workers. Yes, there's this tool. However, the system is so flawed. It's available only after abuse has been occurred and has been proven. And also the process is they have only 1 year within this Open Work Permit, and within this 1 year they have to find an employer with LMA, which is very, very difficult. So there's no debate that the closed work permit system should be abolished. There are quite a few committees, like the standing committee 2009, and there was another standing committee in 2016 that said that employer-specific working permits are abusive, exploitive, and the government has to abolish the system. And lastly, in 2022, the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in person said that visa regimes that tie workers to a specific employer or employment sector should be eliminated because they are exploitive. Next slide. And very quickly, in terms of when people arrive in Canada, and specifically in Ontario, their main complaint is that they don't have access to much information around their rights, or agencies where they can access to when they have questions around their rights. Very recently, because of the federal government gave some funding to few organizations across Canada, and it's a pilot funding allowing migrant workers to access some services. So through this funding, Kairos Canada, they assembled a team that is situated in now in the Pearson Airport. So when workers come, this team is greeting workers and giving them some information, although the impact of this program is still unknown, because I think it's still too early to say. And we all know that the living and working conditions of migrant workers in Ontario are horrible. They are deplorable. They are covered by the Employment Standards Act in Ontario. However, because this act covers only very few workers, even Canadian Ontario resident workers, and it's full with exceptions. For example, quite a few exceptions that applies to different industries. For example, farm workers, including migrant farm workers, cannot form a union. They can be paid legally. They can be paid less than the minimum wage, and they're not paid overtime for their overtime labor, and so on. But I want to leave, and I will finish with this. There are a few videos that we prepared, but I don't know if we have time to. Oh, this is the paycheck that I wanted to show you here, and you see the deductions of this paycheck, all the regular deductions, and then you see at the end of this paycheck, it says Guatemalan daily deduction, transportation recovery cost, other recoverable costs. So you see that, I don't know exactly what Guatemalan daily deduction is. So migrant workers, like employers, can deduct whatever they want from the paycheck of migrant workers. And very quickly, Leah, maybe we can show the video with the injured worker, and the videos they speak by themselves. So in the video, the worker is injured, and it was the worker was not allowed to go to hospital, and because he was suffering a lot, it was his colleagues that called the paramedics. And please pay attention to what is happening, but also pay attention around on the surroundings of where workers live.
See that stretcher? That's how serious it is. See that stretcher come for him. Stretcher. The same man. But then can't come a bunkhouse control done. The supervisor and the whole of them can't the man come through done, and see there? A stretcher have to come for the man.
Yeah. So you see, there at least I can count at least 8 bunk beds in this house. There's no like minimum living conditions, and beside what is happening with the worker. And then there's another video that is showing the spray of chemicals in the field, and migrant workers that are there, that the chemicals are directly sprayed on them there.
Spraying while we're in the field. Spraying while we're in the field.
Thank you so much, Leah. And so with this, I will finish because I don't want to take much time, and Leah will continue to put in the context of the systemic oppression that is built up within the whole system.
Thanks, Varka. I'm gonna go through this pretty fast so that Jovana will also have time to talk, but we can come back to it in the Q&A if you have further questions or you want us to speak to these issues in any more detail. So it's pretty clear that this whole system is designed in a terrible way. We know this, the government knows this, immigration knows this, but it's a way that is working out pretty well for the employers here in Canada. So this whole system of bringing temporary foreign workers into Canada is emblematic of, historical colonial attitudes towards immigration. Canada is a settler colonial state. So I'm sure you've heard the saying that there is no illegal migration on stolen land. So this land has been stolen by Canada, and they pretend that they have the right, and they assume the right to be able to decide who gets to come and who doesn't get to come. So that's a very colonial attitude towards immigration. Another myth is the capitalist myth of market corrections, that somehow, if we have the invisible hand at play here, that the market will fix itself, except we're interfering in the market in ways that are more favorable to the employers. Basic free market principles would say, if you can't find Canadian workers to do this work because you're not paying them enough, well, then you should pay them more. But instead of that, we have a system where we import temporarily low wage workers that are considered expendable. Understanding of high versus low skilled labor, and we call them now the high wage streams or the low wage streams, but there's this notion that these jobs, these essential jobs, are somehow unskilled when there is skill that is involved that's necessary. Like with the mushroom growers, it's 6 months of training before you can go out there and be properly harvesting mushrooms. So these are not low skilled, but they are jobs that are commonly considered of low value in our sort of white patriarchal capitalist society. The workers are temporary, but the work they do is permanent. And we need people working in the fields. We need people who are caregivers. These are not work needs that are going to go away. But in order to maintain a compliant workforce, we make sure that those workers are temporary so that we can easily replace them if they start causing trouble. I mean, the seasonal agricultural worker program was developed in 1966 because people who were working on farms were starting to get together and organize and demand better working conditions. So they introduced the seasonal agricultural worker program as a way to get around that. Another myth is that exploitation is the exception, not the rule. So you'll hear a lot about how, there are a few bad apples out there. There are a few bad employers out there. Now, by no means am I saying that all employers are bad and that all employers are exploitative, but let's just say that the good employers are more of the exception. Because the system is designed in such a way that it is so easy for this type of exploitation to take place. And then another myth is just this notion that these workers should be grateful for the opportunity to come to Canada, that this is almost in a lot of ways like a one-way thing of, aren't we so generous and magnanimous to be allowing these people to come and earn so that they can send money back home. There isn't a really true valuing of the work that they are doing. It's very one-sided. So in conclusion, this whole system is designed to trap and exploit poor racialized migrants for as long as they're needed before discarding them back to their home countries. Although they come to Canada with status, many will fall out of status unless they accept degrading, demeaning, and exploitative scenarios. If you're being exploited and you want to go and work for another employer, you're going to have that whole chunk of time where you don't qualify for EI, you don't qualify for other benefits, and you can't legally work anywhere else. So people in that situation might choose to work without a permit. Or you might not apply because that puts you on the radar for being deported. You might just decide to quietly slip away and go find a new employer and take your risks that way, take your chances that way. So the whole system is set up to facilitate that. So what can you do about it? I know that Jovana is going to speak as well to the direct supports and services that she and you and your organizations can provide to migrant workers. But CNEE, we focus on trying to work for those points of systemic change. So there is a campaign on right now, the Open Work Permits campaign. Varka, do you want to speak to this? Varka has been very involved in this campaign. You dropped the link already. I see. Perfect.
Link already, so people, I'll be asking people to sign the petition. The campaign is asking the federal government to just abolish the employer-specific work permit system. That's it. We have one very clear ask, because this is an exploitative system, and this is one of the main drivers of exploitation of migrant workers in Canada. And so this is the petition. It's going to run until sometime December, and it's been sponsored by Jenny Kwan, the NDP MP, and she will present the petition in the Parliament somewhere in December. So I'm asking people, please, please sign the petition. Forward to your colleagues to sign the petition as well. This petition and this campaign is not in any means and points contradicts or is in competition with the Status for All campaign. Status for All campaign is led by migrant workers, by Migrant Rights Network, and it's asking for permanent residency for people who are in Canada with precarious immigration status, which is what we all want. But meanwhile, also migrant workers who are here with closed work permits, they also need to have open work permits. So it's not in competition; it's it's
Complements.
not. It complements both actions are complementing each other.
Then I'm going to do a quick plug. We do a migrant worker exercise. This is a 1.5 to 2 hour embodied workshop on the temporary foreign worker program that you can find more about on our website. Let's wrap it up now so we can hand it over to Jovana.
Thank you. And thank you a lot for that presentation, and also the videos. They really display like things that I'm hearing from migrant workers directly, but now we're seeing it on TikTok, and we're seeing it being spread to a wider audience. Hopefully that gives some traction to a lot of these movements. I'm just going to share my screen. I'm going to try to go as fast as I can because I know that we want to have time for a second. Frozen. No.
I can give it a shot to share from my end, Jovana, if that helps.
Okay, I think I was just sorry, my whole screen just froze. Let me just, I'm gonna go off camera and I'm gonna see if that's gonna help. Okay, you can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, sorry, my whole screen froze. Okay, I'm gonna try to go as quickly as I can because I do know we want to have lots of questions and answers, and I'm gonna try to focus mostly on some of the things that service providers can do, what to keep in mind when working with anyone who might be in a conditions of exploitation or has lived experience or is at risk. And some of it might be repetitive, so I'll try to skip over it as much as I can. First, just to explain who we are, FCJ Refugee Centre is a nonprofit organization, and we serve uprooted people. So that means any people of all immigration status, whether you're a refugee claimant, a migrant worker, an international student, a protected person, out of status, whatever your immigration status is, we can support. We can try to find ways that we can support you. We're case-centered. We work collaboratively internally with all the teams, but we also work collaboratively with other service providers across Canada. And we have a holistic approach where we apply gender anti-oppressive frameworks. Our programs, this is just a very small summary of our programs. We have, if you ever go to our website at fcjrefugeecenter.org, you will see that it is almost overwhelming how many programs we have and how many events and things we're doing. But we do have the Refugee Claimant Settlement Program and Refugee Protection. We have Popular Education, where we host webinars that for service providers, but also clients. We have the Primary Health Clinic, and then we have the Youth Network, and we have the Anti-Human Trafficking Program, which I will speak to a little bit more. So our work in human trafficking, we founded the Toronto Counter Human Trafficking Network, and I'm currently the coordinator of that. We have been a member of the Canadian Council for Refugee Steering Committee Against Human Trafficking. And within our human trafficking program, we have the Youth Alliance Against Human Trafficking. That is a youth-led program for anyone who is at risk or with lived experience of exploitation. There's a steering committee, they're working on a toolkit, and a lot of workshops and events are born out of that, either with other service providers or directly to youth. We have the Migrant Women's Counter Human Trafficking Alliance as well. So that is for women with lived experience of exploitation or domestic violence. And there is also a steering committee for that, and then workshops and events as well. And women sit on those steering committees. And then last, we have the Migrant Workers Mobile Program. That's a large part of our program. That's where we work with migrant workers who are here either with a permit or without, and are at risk of exploitation or are in some conditions of exploitation, whether that is for labor or sexual exploitation. So I know that we already spoke about the temporary foreign worker program and the ways that workers are exploited through the federal program. I just want to open it up to explain also how people without permits, migrant workers who are working without a work permit may also be exploited. And there's always the elements of coercion and deceit, and usually done through false promises while they're either before they come to Canada or when they arrive to Canada. They're promised a new life in Canada. They're promised work permits, sometimes citizenship, sometimes permanent residency. And while for someone who is more knowledgeable of the immigration system here in Canada, that might seem like a huge red flag, like how you might not be able to wrap your head around how you could believe that someone could get you citizenship or permanent residency. But if you don't understand the immigration system, it's very difficult to navigate. And you are hopeful that the person that you are speaking to and is providing you all this support and promising you these things is telling you the truth. You might be promised good pay and shelter. You might be promised an education. You'll be able to go to school here. Your kids will be able to go to school here. And you might be promised family reunification. So you'll be able to bring your family once you come here. Once you start working, you'll be able to bring the family. As Varka and Leah said, recruiters can be involved either from the country of origin or within Canada. And we often are seeing social media and Facebook being used to advertise jobs and new opportunities because Facebook is used by communities here and across seas to all over the world, really, to communicate with people, to have these groups. And so we do see Facebook being used as a tool for recruitment. And I won't go too much about the federal programs because we did speak about that, but a lot of times we also see debt bondage to the employer or the recruiter, which then forces someone to continue working for someone because they believe that they owe them lots of money and they have high debts to pay off. And so they continue to work for this employer or for this person, even though the working conditions are terrible and exploitive. They might be confined to remote areas with limited access to services, information, and unable to move around freely. And their employer or the person who is either exploiting them or trafficking them might withhold pay and documents and make illegal deductions. As we saw in that pay stub, the deductions could be anything. It can be for liaisons, it can be for clothing, for tools, for food, really anything. And it's very hard for someone who doesn't understand their labor rights, or for someone that doesn't have access to exercising the rights. It'd be hard to be able to argue against those deductions. It's really important when working with anyone who is a newcomer, whatever their immigration status is, to understand the challenges and the factors of vulnerability, and understanding the mindset of someone and why they might not be able to ask for help or leave the situation. They usually have a limited understanding of their rights. There's usually limited access to rights, supports, and services, whether it's due to their location or just not knowing where to turn or who to ask for help. There's usually also reluctance to seek support due to fear, whether it's a fear from the person that's exploiting them, or a fear for their family, or fear the immigration implications, being deported back to their country of origin. Sometimes there'll be language barriers depending where they're from. Sometimes there's restrictions on work. So either they have the employer specific work permit and they can only work for one person, or if they're an international student, they can only work 20 hours until most recently with a temporary policy where they can work 40 hours. But before just last month, it was 20 hours that you can only work, which leaves people needing to find different types of cash jobs for work. They might not have a work permit, and so then they're not sure how they would find new work. Someone is going to employ them without a work permit. They might have employer-specific work permit, like I said. They might have limited tools to report the abuse or the exploitation. They might depend on the trafficker for housing, or maybe even for sponsorship. They may not recognize the situation as exploitive or identify as a victim or survivor. And that's really important to understand, is not everyone will recognize their situation as exploitive, even if you do, and they might not identify as a victim or survivor. So we can't put that label on someone if they're not ready or accepting of or understanding of their situation or wanting to identify that way. It is also really important to understand how different identities intersect and how they impact someone's experience with their situation. If someone's race, any disability, their nationality, gender identity, and sexual orientation all intersect and will create different forms of depression and different experiences that will look different. So not every person you work with that is experiencing exploitation in some way is going to be experienced the same way as other people you may have worked with. And so that means the way that you support them needs to be case by case and very different. Usually service providers will have some sort of intake process where you can assess what their needs are and what they might need to be connected to, because some people are just going to need immigration status. Some people might already have immigration status in process. Maybe they're a refugee claimant and they just need housing. And so those kinds of things are really important to understand when working with them, so that you know that everyone's experience is individual, it's unique, and you need to speak with that person to figure out what they need and ask them what they need instead of assuming what they're going to need. And if I'm talking too fast, please let me know. I'm just trying to be mindful of the time. So some advocacy opportunities, I know we've already mentioned it, but advocacy is a really big part. If you can do this with either individually or with your organization, I know that some service providers just don't have the capacity to be involved in advocacy. There might just be direct services only, but if you can, one, information sharing, awareness building is really important. We like to connect with migrant workers in rural and remote areas and provide them information on their labor rights and recognizing any signs of exploitation. It's important to engage survivors and those at risk through focus groups, projects, committees, advocacy efforts. It's so that you're working with the community and not for. There's also, we really believe in the importance of advocacy with law enforcement, immigration, CBSA, and policymakers. We like to push back on decisions made by immigration and really advocate why the applicant that for a certain application should be eligible for this application, even if they've been refused. And then lastly, any campaigns. These were already mentioned, but I have included them on my slide. The Open Work Permits Now campaign that Varka spoke about. That one. Simple ask is just abolishing closed work permits, and I think that's important and can be done. And then also there's a Status for All by the Migrant Rights Network asking for regularization of all migrant workers. Here is a kind of a diagram of the migration exploitation cycle. And we like to try to break it up here by trying to get to migrant workers where they are in rural and remote areas, in their cities and towns where maybe there's not a lot of service providers. We give them information about support and about their rights there. There might be language barriers, so it's difficult for them to access government services. So we try to find ways that we can support them in doing so. Sometimes we're acting as interpreters. Sometimes we go with clients to the police station, to Service Canada, all those kinds of things. And if you have the capacity to do so, to set those kinds of supports up, then it's great. Or use interpretation services so that who you're working with understands what's going on. They're involved in the process, and they're fully understanding if they have limited English. Some potential indicators of exploitation that you can watch out for is when we're looking at working and living conditions, they might not be free to come and go as they please, whether that's because they've been told that if they leave the housing that they're in, that they're going to be caught by a CBSA, by the Canadian border, and be deported, or they might actually be told that they're not allowed to leave if they're by their employer, by whoever is housing them. They may find the work differs from what originally promised by employers, which we mentioned. So whether that is their role itself or the actual work or the location or pay, it might be different than what was promised either on their contract or verbally. They might be unpaid or paid very little or only paid through tips. They might work excessive long hours or unusual hours and hardly receive breaks. We see this a lot with caregivers as well who are living in the homes. They don't really get time off, or they get very limited time off. They're not given health or safety training or protections, and they're living in poor and substandard housing. I'm going to try to wrap up in the next 5 minutes. So if I said anything too fast, please ask me later. Their emotional behavioral indicators might be that they're fearful, they're anxious, they're submissive, or they're depressed. They might be withdrawn or MIA. They might be distrustful and have difficulty with attachment. And by distrustful, I mean of you or law enforcement or anyone. They might be hesitant to share information. They might avoid eye contact, and they might seem exhausted, malnourished, and have poor concentration. They also might have a lack of control of their personal possessions. So that might be that could be their bank account, that could be their phone, that could be their personal identification, which I have down there. They might not have control of their own money or have very limited control of their money. Like I said, they might not have control of their own personal identification documents, their passport was taken away, or their identity cards were taken away. And we've seen this happen through the federal program as well. Employers doing that, not often. I don't see it as often, but we do see it with cases where there is labor trafficking involved, or sex trafficking. They might seldom or never given the opportunity to speak for themselves. That even is true for people in the federal programs. If Service Canada is calling to investigate or ask the worker how about the conditions of their work, sometimes the employer is with them in the room or on the phone with them, and they're afraid to speak. Or they're not able to negotiate their own working conditions. They don't really have any control of their working conditions, and they don't have any sort of way to negotiate those kind of conditions. It's also super important to understand that human trafficking and smuggling is different, and it really comes down a lot to consent. Human smuggling, it's a voluntary act, and it's only crossing a border, and after that, the relationship ends after the border crossing. With human trafficking, there was never consent, or the consent was meaningless because it was obtained through irregular means. So it was obtained through false promises, or through threats or force. And then the cross-border movement happens there's cross-border movement, but it also happens within the country as well. And the relationship continues with the exploitation of the person for profit. So if they are brought into the country, they still have communication with who brought them into Canada or who recruited them into Canada. And this is the same with sex work and sex trafficking. It's important to understand the difference because it's very harmful when you're working with someone who is in sex work and is identifying as a sex worker and labeling them as being a victim of sex trafficking. With sex work, they enter voluntarily, either through choice or their circumstances. They have control over their working conditions, they have control over their profits, and they have an option to exit. They're not controlled by a third party. With sex trafficking, consent is not there. They didn't enter voluntarily. They don't have control of their working conditions. They don't have control of their profits. They are controlled by a third party, and they don't have an option to exit, or they have very limited options to exit. And so this here, I'm not going to go into the details of these. These are the immigration remedies that we at FCJ are able to support with, or a lawyer could support with as well, but we can support without a lawyer as well. But I'm not going to go too much in detail of these because if you're not doing the applications, you might not need to know exactly the fine details of it. But I do want you to understand that there are some options for people. So if somebody who is either out of status and has been a victim of trafficking, they might feel like there's no options for them anymore and that they need to go back to their country of origin, even if they want to stay in Canada after their experience. So it's important to know that there are some options. It's never guaranteed. We can never guarantee approval for an immigration application, but we can support them in trying to apply. So the first one is a temporary resident permit. This is the first time we apply. It's for free. For immigration, there's no fee. They're able to get an open work permit and get healthcare. But it is, and it's available to anyone that doesn't have legal status. But there are limitations of it as well. Long processing times, like almost any immigration application, there's long processing times, inconsistencies of who's accepted and who's rejected, because immigration officers don't always apply the same guidelines. There are fees for every time you reapply. So a subsequent application is going to cost $355 every time. The first time it's approved, it's usually for 6 months, and after that, maybe a year. And it's very difficult to get it approved every time because a lot of it depends if there's an investigation happening, and if there's not, or if the investigation is concluded, it's very difficult for the applicant to have an approval. And there is no right for family reunification until you are able to apply for permanent residency, which is after 5 years of being a temporary resident permit with this permit, because this is for victims of trafficking. So you'd have to be a TRP holder of this TRP for 5 years. consecutively, and then you could apply for permanent residency. So that's a very difficult pathway to permanent residency. And lastly, immigration will consult with CBSA and police. So then there's also the, sorry, my screen went black here. I don't know if you can see. Okay, let me just try to see if I can present from here.
We can still see your screen, Jovana.
Oh, okay, because mine, it went away. I'll continue talking while I get to it. So the open work permit for vulnerable workers, this is a work permit that was designed for workers in the temporary foreign worker program who have an employer-specific work permit who are facing abuse in the workplace. It is an open work permit. They would have to apply and they would have to have evidence of their exploitation or abuse to be able to be approved. And it is a free application. And if approved, it's valid for 12 months. But again, there's limitations to it again. One, recently we're seeing the seasonal workers are being refused at a higher rate than someone who has a 2-year contract. It's inconsistent with what evidence of abuse is accepted, and it's only available to someone with a valid tied work permit, and it requires a survivor to then tie themselves to another employer again after the 12 months. After the 12 months that it's valid, then you would have to get another close work permit, and so it could leave you in the same situation again. And then lastly, it's the humanitarian compassion application. This is for application for permanent residency. It's very complex. You have to show how you've established yourself in Canada. And if you're working with anyone who's out of status and does not have any options for gaining status, this might be their only option. And it's important for them to be involved in the community, whether that is volunteering with your organization, volunteering in the community, getting letters from friends, going to any sort of religious establishment, showing that they're involved in the community and they've established a life here, and that leaving would cause more hardship. It does not stop any removal procedures. So if they do get a removal order, the agents, just because there's an agency in process, it won't really support their case. And also, it's a very difficult application. It requires a lot of documentation, and you have to be here for at least 2 years to be able to prove that you've established yourself here. So besides the immigration supports, it is someone that has been exploited in Canada might have different needs that you need to address. And a lot of the times we see for labor trafficking or sex trafficking, we're seeing large cases where it is like recently we've seen cases where there's over 40 migrant workers who are being trafficked with the same person, and they're being removed from the housing that was provided to them. And then now we have that over 40 people who need support getting housing. They need support speaking to the police for law enforcement. They need support finding employment once they have their open work permits from their TRPs. Some of them need healthcare because they haven't seen a doctor in who knows how long. We had a case where someone was diabetic and they didn't have their medication. They most likely will need trauma counseling if they're ready for that. They might need legal court support, and they might need some settlement support as well. And so all of these things may be present in the case, like maybe supports that they need, but it also may not be. And it's very important to understand by speaking to the person, seeing what they need support with, to be able to address those needs. And that their needs may change. They may later decide that they do want to speak to law enforcement, or they do want to go to counseling. And so we really believe in having an open door policy and also continuing that support. So once that immigration application is done, our support doesn't end there. They can come back to us if they decide that they need a different kind of support. And most importantly, things that you should not do. You don't want to react verbally or physically to communicate disgust or shock. You don't want to dispute any facts or comment on motivation, just listen. You don't want to accept that the person to recognize their situation as exploitive or see themselves as a victim in need of rescuing. You don't want to assume sole responsibility for meeting the person's needs, no additional sources of support, understand your capacity limits, and don't promise anything that you cannot keep. But you can be non-judgmental, listen and don't make assumptions. Check yourself. Are you tense, resistant, uncomfortable with the subject? Do you have your own triggers that will trigger some sort of emotional response? You can believe them. You can ask if they're safe or what would make them feel safe. You can allow them for choice. Don't control the conversation. Something that's very important for us is that we always tell them their options and we don't tell them what to do. We give them the options. We tell them what might be the risks and what might be the benefits, and then leave that choice with them. And lastly, you can let them know if you don't have the answer, and with their permission, reach out to other supports. And that's always important. That goes in hand with don't make any promises you can't keep. Okay, I've gone over some time, but that's all. These are just our anti-human trafficking team here. This is the contact. We have a women's coordinator, we have a youth coordinator, and we have a migrant caseworker as well. And you can always connect with me first, and then I can connect you to the right person after, if it's a youth or woman or whatever the case may be. So thank you. Yeah, if you have any questions, I can answer them.
Well, thank you so much, Leah, Varka, and Jovana, for such an informative presentation. I know we got a lot of details regarding labor exploitation, what that looks like, the systems that have created it, advocacy around it, and being able to see what type of supports are available. So thank you again. At this time, we would invite folks, if you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself, or you can put it in the chat box as well. But yeah, please feel free to go ahead and ask any questions. Please go ahead, Jenny. I see your hand raised.
Oh, hi there. Sorry, I'm getting my camera on. Thank you so much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. I just have a question around the legal options that folks have around this. So if they do want to connect with either a lawyer or a legal clinic that could support them to, perhaps complaining about an employer that is being, exploitive or abusive in any way, like what are the legal options that folks have in this case?
It would depend on what they're wanting. Like if they want compensation for their hours worked that they never received, then we would refer them to a legal clinic that specializes in employment law. If they wanted, if sometimes we'll have clients who want a restraining order from the person, then we would refer them to a criminal lawyer that would be able to support with that. And there is a lawyer that would do it pro bono, because she works for the government, and it just depends on what it is. If they want just to see an investigation happen, then we would ask if they want to be referred to police. It would just depend on what their end goal is, really.
And just referring back to your answer with regarding the legal clinic, what legal clinic would be able to support them? Do you have any folks that you work with? Yeah. We
refer to Parkdale Clinic a lot, and then we also have referred to IAVGO, who supports injured workers, and so it just depends on what the situation is, but Parkdale is one that we refer to a lot.
A few years ago, there were a few legal clinics that combined their forces together, and there were a few from Mississauga, Kitchener, and few other clinics. So they were called, Jovana, maybe you know, because now it slips my mind, but they were called a mobile legal clinic, who was supporting. So there were a few lawyers from those few clinics that were supporting specifically migrant workers within their processes, labor, immigration, whatever processes. Maybe it can be online. I can look for it, but there was, and I think they're still functioning.
Yeah, is there any way to share those resources? If not today, it'd be really helpful if you could send it to the organizers of the session, either Tinbit or Jesse, and they could share it with all of us who attended. Thank you.
Jesse, please go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you so much for this presentation. I learned a lot. I know I can also thank you so much for being mindful of the time. I know there's so much information that can be shared and remains to be shared. But I'm just wondering, kind of also thinking about resources, are there also specific points of contact that like folks who are supporting migrant workers and newcomers with varying status that they could reach out to, that provide like on the ground support, maybe that are operating in more locations closer to some of where maybe the rural areas where these farms are, or things like that? I'm thinking about like advocacy organizations or anybody else that's operating in that kind of a way of being that kind of point of contact that they could then also connect them with folks or provide their own support as well.
Sorry, I didn't know if Varka, you were answering it. I mean, there are different organizations that do work in rural areas and places that migrant workers are. Like if you're in Windsor, there's the Legal Assistance of Windsor. There's in Simcoe, there's I forget the name of it, but it's like Simcoe Welcome Center. MWOC, Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, is an organization that supports workers kind of all over. Kairos also supports, and then we also do like mobile clinics as well at FCJ. So if there are workers, it's sometimes harder for us if we don't already have the partnership or the communication with the workers. But if we work with other legal clinics or anything around Ontario, then we can go and we can meet with workers there and give mobile clinics. And I can give you like a list of some of those resources as well later.
Also, maybe as we wait for if there's any other questions that folks have, again, just thank you for being mindful of the time. I know we wanted to kind of have this time for Q&A and a lot this time, but if there's anything that you might want to come back to that you might not have had a chance to cover in more detail, we might have some time for that as well.
I see Jenny has her hand raised. I do also see a comment that just came in right before you raised your hand. And perhaps, I see there, Jovana and Julie can connect. Please go ahead, Jenny.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, like, how successful are HNC applications for sex trafficking cases, in your experience?
To be honest, I don't know. Most of the agencies that were human trafficking I saw were labor trafficking, and it's still going to be dependent on the establishment in Canada. For sure, we would reference the hardships that they faced in Canada and sort of the risks that could happen again if they were to leave Canada too, because all the supports are here and everything. But it's still going to matter the establishment or best interest of the children if they have children here. And so that's going to be the strongest point. It's proving those points. And agencies they're difficult applications. Some applications are really strong and they still get refused. And I've seen the reasons for it, and they can be sometimes, I don't know, like we had someone the officer was saying that there was no proof that the money that the applicant was making in Canada was going to benefit their family in the Philippines. like was providing a better life, and that we obviously know it is, but yeah, it can be difficult.
And agencies are very arbitrary as well, and it's still around. I haven't checked lately, but it was around 5% of acceptance rate. Not the human trafficking agencies in general, all agencies that are submitted. So it's next to nothing. Also more for human trafficking and exploitation. While people are thinking about questions, I want to invite all of you to come. So Canadian Council for Refugees, Leah mentioned that we are part of Canadian Council for Refugees as well. So their full consultation will be in Toronto between 24th of November to 26th of November. Within this Canadian Council for Refugees consultation, people from community, social service workers, settlement workers, and all frontline workers can participate. There are lots of workshops. In terms of human trafficking, if you're still interested and continue to be interested, the day before the consultation, our CCR Trafficking Committee is organizing a forum on human trafficking. I will drop the link in the chat. So the forum will be in-person forum. And it will take place in Mary War Center, which is downtown Toronto, University of Toronto. It will be on 23rd of November. So there will be 2 sessions in the forum. In the morning session, we're gonna, 2 people who developed a tool called exploitation, spectrum of exploitation tool. It will be a training session for frontline workers in a way to assess, but also to reflect on the points of oppression and exploitation that their clients face, and how, what to do, and like what are the remedies. So it will be very practical training session. And then in the afternoon session, we're going to discuss the changes of the criminal code definition on human trafficking. You may know that currently the criminal code definition is being discussed. Changes to the definition are discussed in the Senate, and soon they're going to go to the House of Parliament. And we're going to discuss with some prosecutors and lawyers and immigration support workers how this will may reflect on and impact internationally trafficked persons as well. So welcome you to come up.
Thank you, Varka, for sharing that. Can you
I'll
put the
share.
link back and then thank you.
Yeah.
Lovely. Okay.
I also wanted to make another point, if we have time. Many times, and Jovana mentioned some of the indicators around how to recognize human trafficking. I want to steer in a bit different direction and just mention. So from conversations with partners and stuff, and because of the high hysteria around human trafficking, when we are using indicators, we have to be a bit mindful. Because if we take single indicators, it may lead us to harmful conclusions. So when we are using indicators of human trafficking, we should be mindful of not taking them out of the context as well, because taken as each one by itself, it can be different things. Like we have, people who are working in massage parlors, they have, they work unusual hours, they work, different hours, or so just to make point of this, because many partners we discussed with from the sex worker community have been harmed by the vigilance that indicators of human trafficking create, like this wrong vigilance in a way. So we have to be mindful when we're using the indicators. And sometimes, that it might be a non-status person, and we can wrongly refer them to law enforcement where we should not refer them, because we took some of the signs as signs of human trafficking. So we have to be mindful of this. Just a quick comment.
Yeah, I think that goes in with not assuming like someone is a victim or survivor and making sure they're identifying their situation as that, as exploitive, and like making sure that they're part of all the steps of your service and support, whether that's you're making a referral or not.
So if folks don't have any more questions, I just wanted to take the time to say thank you for everyone attended. Thank you again. It was quite an informative. There's much more information much more information that can be found on your website. And on behalf of the two employment working groups that two of the TSLIP working groups that organized session, the Newcomer Services Collaboration Working Group, as well as the Employment Working Group, we want to thank everyone for being here. And as Jesse had mentioned at the beginning, the recordings will be available once we have them on our YouTube page, on TSLIP's YouTube page. We'll be able to share that with all of those that have attended and registered, as well as the links that were shared in the chat. We'll be able to share that with everyone. So yes, I thank you so much for being here. I hope everyone has a great day. And I don't know if Jesse wanted to share anything else.
Nope. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for attending. Enjoy
Bye.
the rest of your week.
Take care, everyone.
All right, thank you.